For the last section of this workshop, we are going to learn about how to create module-specific, building-specific settings. So thus far, we've created settings for the entire project that allows you to override occupant density on a per template basis. But you may wish to attach settings to individual buildings. And we're going to see how to do that by examining how you would set up a per building occupant density override. So not based on the template, but based on the building itself. Let's go back to Visual Studio, see how to do that. UMI has built in a facility for keeping track of building-specific settings. And the Visual Studio template you installed actually sets that up for you. So you'll notice in the Solution Explorer, there's a file called buildingsettings.cs. It's very rudimentary. It's just a class called building settings. That is a type of settings object. And it just has an ID, which is the ID of the Rhino object as stored in the database. There are no actual settings here. As a module author, you'll want to add settings to this to describe these custom settings you want. For our workshop, we're only going to create one. We're going to call it an occupant density override. So this is when you want to ignore not only the occupant density set in the UMI template, but also set in your module for that template. You want a specific occupant density for that one building. Okay? And its type is double with a question mark, which is a decimal number that might not actually be set. You might not want to set an override, right? For most buildings, you probably don't, but maybe you have a special case you want to handle differently. So we add this to our settings object. Now we need to use it. There are two ways we need to use it. The first way is we need to provide a way for users to actually set what it is. And we're going to use a similar technique that we did for setting the per template overrides. We're going to create a new command that allows the user to basically type the override in for the building they have selected. Okay. So I will create a new UMI command. If you don't have this again, you can just copy the boilerplate from other UMI commands in your project and use that new GUID tool in the Tools menu, Visual Studio. And we will call our command UMI set occupant density override. So this gets created for us. Great. As with all Rhino commands that take numbers, you need to set an initial value. So let's just start with 0 for simplicity's sake. .0. Okay. And we're going to use Rhino get to get a number from the user. Rhino get. There's our red squiggle, so I will use rhino.input to get number. Enter. Override. False, because they have to enter something and then store it in this variable I've already created. Okay. Once again, we'll see if the result was not successful. And if it was not, we will just return it. So if these are canceled, we will cancel the command. If there is an error, the command will have an error. We won't do any more work. So now we know that occupant density override is set to what they typed in. Now, unlike most Rhino commands, we're not going to give them an opportunity to choose an object. We're just going to assume that they've already selected the building that they want to change the override for. If you're building a real command, you probably want to give them a way to pick an object, but that is out of scope for this workshop. So we'll just do the simpler thing. Okay. First, we need to find the selected Rhino objects. Okay. There can be more than one of them, so we'll get them all. And those come from the Rhino document, this Rhino doc object. We go to the objects table and we get selected objects. We don't want to include lights or grips. Those are not real UMI objects that we care about, so we don't care if they're selected. So we just say false, false. No lights and no grips. Okay. So those are the Rhino objects. Now we want to get the UMI buildings, because not all of those objects might be buildings. We do that using the context, because this is an UMI thing we're doing. We're going to say context.buildings.forObjects, and then we give it the selected Rhino objects. So now we only have selected Rhino objects that are UMI buildings, because those are the only ones that it makes sense to actually set an override for. And now for each of those buildings, what we're going to do is we're going to get the settings for them, and we're going to update those settings. So let's say first we need to get all the building settings that we care about. Actually, let's call it settings for all buildings. And those come from the UMI context, like everything else UMI. And here's what we do. We say get settings, and then we give it the type of the settings object we care about. Okay, and that's this building settings object. This was created for you, but we added occupant density override. And when we say context.get settings, this is a settings object that contains the settings for every building in the project. So now what we do is for each of our selected buildings, we're going to go through and update the associated settings for that building. So for each building, we find that building, and we say settings for all buildings. Let's extract the settings object for this building. .get or create. And then we give it the selected building ID. So what this says is, for each selected UMI building, find its ID, and then get that settings object if it exists, or if it doesn't exist, make a new one. So either way, we get a settings object for this particular building. And once we have that settings object, all we have to do is set the override. And this is the occupant density override they typed earlier. So for each building, we set that override. Okay. Now we need to actually use this somewhere, right? We need to use this in our calculator. So let's go to the calculator and do that. Calculator being, of course, this calculate bidder occupancy command. And what we were doing before was we were getting the occupant density out of the template. And that's all well and good. But we should do another step after we get that. We should check to see if this building has an actual override that we should use instead. So as before, the first thing we need to do is we need to get the settings for all the buildings so we can search through it. Okay. So we'll do that up here, the same place we got the database objects and the project setting. Context.get settings for our building settings type. And now, after we've gotten the occupant density for the template, let's also just check and see if we should be overriding it. So what we'll do is we'll say settings for building, building settings. We're going to say try get instead of get or create. Because if there wasn't a building settings object, we don't want to create one just because we tried to read from it. We only want to create one when the user intentionally wants to do that. So we'll say try get. And this means that if there is no settings object, this will just be null. This will not be set to anything. Okay. So now we say if there were settings and those settings included an override value that exists, occupant density that override has value. Because remember, the building settings were optional. You don't have to set an override here. So it might not be set. But we're going to say if there was a settings object and that had a value, oh, it should be not null, excuse me. Then use the override and set the occupant density to the override value. And now we'll use that override instead. So now, if we run this override command to set an override, when we do the calculation, it should use the overridden value. Let's give it a shot. We'll load our project. Go to our module panel. We still have our old occupancy values for one of these, but let's change one of them. So for this building, which is our retail building, okay, we have 3 occupants. Let's set the override. UMI set occupant density override for this building. And we don't have an override, so it's set to 0 right now. But let's say that we want it to be, I don't know, 0.05. We set that. Now, when we run our simulation, so to speak, we should get a new value. And I'll have to, it didn't automatically update here, but if I deselect and reselect, let's see if we get a new value. We did. It updated, right? We got a new value. We can set it to something ridiculous so that we can see the math in action, right? So now when we do the calculation, you can see that we have 15,000 people in this building because, you know, we're cramming them in there like sardines. But that's working. That's what we wanted. And so what we've seen here is how you can set building-specific settings within UMI and use those to adjust your simulation results and have UMI handle the entire saving and restoring them for you.